G'day, brothers and sisters. This is the other Paul, and welcome back to another long-awaited, well, okay, not really long-awaited, but another live stream, which has been lacking for a while. But in any event, I'm here with my friend Matt Hedges. Matt, how are you going this fine Australian afternoon?
I'm doing good. It's not an afternoon over here though. It's 9:30.
Oh, really?
So
nah, bro. I thought time zone.
Yeah.
I thought there was no such thing as time zone.
Other side of the world over here.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, we are here for, and for everyone else watching, we are here for a very important topic for those who are interested in debates regarding free will, regarding the Reformed tradition or Calvinism, as it's often known, as well as with the many, shall we say, emotional elements of that debate, which can become very clear when interacting with people of certain personalities, certain traditions, so on and so forth. But before we get to that, Matt, why don't you give us some context? Who are you?
Yeah, nothing really that interesting. I write at the Soli Deo Gloria Apologetics blogspot. I read everything I can on theology and church history. That's kind of the area I like to study. I'd like to do master's work in the area in the future. And so that's really what I'm doing right now. Nothing too fancy.
Excellent. Why this issue in particular on the Reformed tradition and free will, predestination, and so on?
Yeah, well, the issue of predestination and free will obviously is one that's been debated for centuries. And even long before the Reformation, you see the early stages of it with St. Augustine and the Pelagian controversy in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. And it's something really I struggled with personally for about 3 or so years, how to really solve how it was that predestination does not lead to just straight up like a sort of stoic fatalism where everything is absolutely necessitated. And for a while, I held to the solution, what's known as compatibilism, especially as it's taught by Jonathan Edwards. But then I began to realize over time that this is not actually the historic Reformed view, that compatibilism and libertarianism are categories that you see around the Enlightenment and afterwards, and they're still in use in Calvinist Arminian debates today. And after reading even just basic texts such as the Westminster Confession and digging into the Reformation scholastics of the 16th and 17th centuries, I began to realize that ultimately they were thinking in completely different terms. And specifically, they were using the metaphysics of necessity and contingency and borrowing from the Thomist tradition, as well as from Scotus, in order to explain how it is that though God's decree is eternal and is infallible, that does not take away the liberty and contingency of human agents.
Okay, mad. And so to jump right into that, actually, briefly before we do that, as usual, people, there will be a Q&A at the very end, and there will be priority for questions from people who are supporters on Locals or who give a super chat. So just to quickly get that out of the way, and actually I will put up, well, I'll also promote my Locals, become a supporter on Locals to get some cool benefits and to help me turn this into a job. It's been a bit of a rough ride at the very beginning of this year for me in terms of being able to work on stuff at the moment, but that is being quickly mitigated. Great content is on the way, including and especially this stream right now as it's happening, and much more coming on down the line, including my video response to Inspiring Philosophy on Christian Nationalism, which has been delayed for a couple of reasons, including, with all respect to him, with just how all over the place his case is, forcing me to jump to and fro between videos, rewrite things, so on and so forth. But also some personal stuff, which I'd appreciate prayer for. But in any event, the stuff is happening and you will get awesome benefits if you become a supporter. Anyway, with that said, Matt, can you summarize what your perception of the current state of the debate is on this matter?
Yeah, the current state of the debate is that both Calvinists and Arminians don't really have a good grasp at all on what Reformed theology is taught about free choice. And by Calvinists, I mean even some popular figures, such people like MacArthur or James White. I would argue that due to a lot of their anti-scholastic tendencies, they don't really actually hold to the historic Reformed position on how free will works, or how even the will works in general, and how to define or what grounds the will's freedom. They would agree that the will's free, but what we disagree about is why the will is free, what the formal cause or basis is for the will's freedom and its contingency. And Arminians also misunderstand it. And that's honestly, I mean, I know I am putting a lot of blame on the neo-Calvinists, but a lot of the reasons Arminians misunderstand it so much is because the only thing they've been taught about our tradition is like Edwardsian compatibilism that you see in like the New England Puritans and onwards. They completely skip over the 16th and 17th centuries where there's so much rich material. And it's a shame that that's often skipped over today, but thankfully we're starting to see more of a retrieval of that tradition today. And that has, of course, led to a recognition of what the Reformed tradition has actually taught about this issue.
Yeah, I'm glad to be saying that as well myself, even though I'm nowhere near your depth in the issue. But even just with dipping my toes into that, I can already see how a lot of the modern debate is critically misframed. But I'm also curious because I hear you earlier talking about how compatibilism, even that is a post-reformed innovation that's not really with respect to the, not really authentic to the, with respect to the original tradition. So I'm curious, before we go much more deeper, because I know there'd be a number of people here perhaps who are whether Calvinists in the popular sense or even people who are deeper on this issue and do try to read the Reformed scholastics, but who may nonetheless identify as compatibilists, which I more or less do with the basic assertions of such. So could you briefly, to begin us with, explain what is compatibilism and how is it different, and how does it depart from the original Reformed position?
Yeah, so one thing about compatibilism is that it ultimately really oversimplifies the issue to just simply say that for the will to be free, you just simply have to do what you desire. And while that's certainly, I mean, that's a true statement in a sense, it is way too simplistic. And it also, one of the biggest compatibilist critiques of its counterpart, libertarianism, is the concept of the ability to do otherwise as the ground for freedom. All right, modern compatibilists generally, obviously I'm not saying this about every compatibilist necessarily, but a lot of compatibilists will like to paint libertarianism as Arminian, and the idea of the ability to do otherwise as not being the basis for freedom, and they try to disassociate that from Reformed theology. When in reality, actually, that very idea is actually what the Reformed tradition teaches. The Reformed tradition teaches that man does have the ability to do otherwise, and that in the moment of choosing, the action is contingent because it can be otherwise than it is. That's how we define contingency to begin with. It's that which cannot be, that which can be in a different way than it is. It's not absolutely necessary. And so there's a distinction we make in scholastic theology. You'll see this as early, if I remember correctly, as Aristotle even, and then it's in Aquinas, and then the reformers, including Calvin and his successors, take this over, which is a distinction between what we call a necessity consequent and a necessity of the consequence. The necessity of the consequent would be like an absolute intrinsic necessity, like the necessity by which fire burns, for example. That's its nature. It can't do otherwise than burn and give off heat. Whereas a necessity of the consequence, which is the really important category for discussing free choice, is what we would call a hypothetical necessity, or a necessity of supposition, such that there's not an absolutely necessary connection between the antecedent and consequent of a proposition. Like if I say, if God wills that Bob will go to the store, then Bob will go to the store. In a necessity of the consequence, it means that Bob still has an intrinsic potency or ability to not go to the store, even though that is what God has decreed him to do. And I'll get into more about how this does not in any way like do away with the doctrine of the divine decrees at all. And I can provide multiple quotes from the Reformed tradition, even Westminster Confession itself, and the Westminster Divines, showing that this is what they taught and believed.
Excellent. Okay, so that's a great start. And to put in some necessary context, I guess more necessary context for helping to jolt people into a greater sense of perspective in this debate, because of course, as you, with your summary of the state of debate, of the state of the current debate, it's pretty poor. And I can add to that, on top of what we said about how this is about Calvinism, quote unquote. But as a matter of fact, it's the Reformed tradition is taking place in actually a family of traditions that tend to share actually a decent number of such propositions, which are lumped under Calvinism. So could you explain the Reformed tradition in how it relates to Thomism and Scotism on this matter, and any other traditions you may think worthy of note?
Yeah, so I would say overall, on the subject of free choice, overall, we see a strong continuity with Aquinas and the Thomist tradition, specifically what we see in the Dominicans. And what's important to realize is that, as you see in the early 17th century, the Synod of Dort and the controversy against Arminius and his followers with the Reformed, there's another controversy that's happening at around the same time, which is the controversy between the Jesuits and the Dominicans. This is known as the De Auxiliis controversy, and it was about the nature of efficacious grace, and specifically how God moves the will to act, yet in such a way that preserves the will's freedom and contingency. So these two controversies are happening at about the same time. There's a very good book, if anyone wants more information on this, called Beyond Dort and De Auxiliis, that kind of compares these two controversies as they're happening side by side in that early modern period. And it just shows ultimately that the Dominicans, the Spanish Thomists, are actually very similar to the Reformed, whereas the Arminians are very similar to the Jesuits and the Molinists, right? The followers of Luis de Molina, people like Pedro de Fonseca, right? That's a Spanish Jesuit. He taught middle knowledge just like Molina did, or Francisco Suarez. You see that the Reformed are pushing back on this and are kind of, there's this kind of almost alliance forming with the Thomists, even if it's not direct. I'm not saying there was any like established relationship, but in terms of theological ideas, there's a strong similarity between the way the Dominicans are talking and the way the Reformed are talking. And many of the concepts that the Dominicans are using to elucidate the earlier teaching of Thomas Aquinas are being borrowed by the Reformed to refute Arminianism, and also Socinianism, which also made errors on the same issue.
Okay, far out. Yeah. So this is, as you explained, this is part of a much wider, well, really, if anything, a preceding debate that continued on for quite a while, and the Reformed tradition simply picked that up and kept it going. So, in other words, it's not Calvinism versus Arminianism. It's Thomism, Scotism, the Reformed tradition, any subvariants thereof, versus
Arminianism. Yeah.
Yeah. And even then, classical Arminianism versus Wesleyan Arminianism versus provisionism, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So it's actually a much wider debate than these very simple categories we have there. You gave me earlier a decent list of these subtopics of defining the Reformed tradition. So, and I guess rather than me dictating, okay, explain this, explain that, I'll let you basically give the rundown of the Reformed tradition on the issue according to whatever order of the issues you feel best to address them. But just before that, how would you explain the Molinist position in contrast to the Reformed / Thomistic position, since that, at least in the early days, was the major opponent of such?
Yeah. So one thing about Molinism is obviously the most famous thing that Luis de Molina is known for is his concept of the scientia media, the middle knowledge, whereby God knows what we call counterfactuals, like what a creature would do in a certain set of circumstances, and that this knowledge exists structurally or logically prior to God's decree. And of course, we can get into that as well. I mean, Molinism, I would argue, ultimately leads to a heretical doctrine of God and his attributes altogether, and is a very dangerous doctrine which must be rejected by the church. But Molinism has another concept of what we call divine concurrence, which divine concurrence is the way in which God works with man and his will. Like, how does the divine providence relate to man's will and his actions? And the Molinist view of divine concurrence is that when God moves the will, the divine will and the human will are working together as partial causes to actualize a certain effect. In his Concordia, Molina gives the analogy of two men pulling a boat, and both of these are necessary and sufficient conditions for that action of pulling the boat to be completed and brought from potency to act. So Molina uses that analogy to illustrate God's will and man's will as partial causes. That would not be the way that the Thomists and the Reformed understand it. They usually say that both are complete causes. You know, it's not like the divine will and the human will combine together to form some sort of tertium quid, right? Like a third thing out of two to make an action. It's two complete causes working alongside each other, and of course the divine will is the primary cause and the human will is the secondary cause. That's the language that the Westminster Confession uses, and it's also found in Thomas Aquinas. In the Molinist scheme, when God moves the human will, he only moves it from potency to act, but this is a general and indefinite concurrence. So it would just simply mean that God, when moving from potency to act, does not determine the species of the act, right? Like that is such that it is this act rather than that act. If God moves you to act, he's not moving you to do any sort of particular deed. He's simply moving you to act generically, right? So that's why we call it a general and indefinite concurrence. The Reformed and Thomist understanding, and I think the best articulation of the Thomist understanding is in Domingo Bañez, who was one of Molina's main opponents. He was a Spanish Dominican. And what Bañez said was that when God moves the human will through what we call physical premotion, when God moves the will from potency to act, what happens is that God not only determines that the creature will act, he also determines what act the creature will do. And that will later also provide for an explanation of how God can move the human will, and yet God is not the author of sin. He's not the cause. He's not the efficient cause of evil or anything like that. That explanation that Bañez gives will deal with that, and that same explanation is also utilized by Reformed scholastics, including some of the delegates to the Synod of Dort. They were borrowing from Thomism.
Okay, great. So again, great complexities, much more than most people realize. And so in light of that, you give me a decent list of things to discuss, define divine possibility, the simultaneity of potencies, and so on and so forth. But obviously, since you're much more versed in that, I'll let you. I guess this will just be the place where you just give the basic rundown of the matter, and so I'll let you address those in your order. And so, with that said, with that context established, just what does the Reformed tradition say about the freedom of the will?
Yeah, so the first thing is that there's a concept which I want to introduce, which is really important. That's called synchronic contingency. Synchronic contingency. And so first of all, it's important to know, well, what is contingency, right? Contingency simply means that a thing is contingent if it is able to not be. All right, so the world is contingent. God could have chosen not to create the world. It's possible that the world could not exist. And the fact that it is possible that the world cannot exist means that the existence of the world and the material universe that you and I experience every day, that existence is something that's contingent and is ultimately founded upon the divine will, right? In him we live and move and have our being. That's what Paul says to the Greeks in Acts 17. And so synchronic contingency is applying that concept of contingency to the issue of the human will. And it means basically that whenever I choose to do an action, whenever I actualize a potency that I have, for example, I have the potency to, pick up my mouse right now, right? When I actualize that potency in the same exact moment that I am picking up my mouse, I also have a potency to not pick up my mouse, right? So say you have two contrary potencies, two different actions, right? Sitting and running, right? You can't sit and run at the same time. Right, that would be a contradiction. You can't actualize two contrary potencies. But if you actualize one potency, such as sitting, that does not remove the potency of running. So Aristotle famously talked about, like, when Socrates sits down, he does not have the potency to perform contradictory things at the same time, but he still does have the power or potency to do either of those. And that means that Socrates' action of sitting is free. It's contingent. It's able to be otherwise. While sitting, he retains the potency to run, and that possibility of running exists simultaneously with the actuality of his sitting down, of his action of sitting. And so that's the Reformed understanding. If you want a sample of Reformed divines actually fleshing this out, what I would recommend is this book by Dr. Richard Muller called Divine Will and Human Choice, Freedom, Contingency, and Necessity in Early Modern Reformed Thought. That's where I would start. And there's a section in there where
I see you going with the J. Dyer method of sticky notes in your books.
Yeah. No, but for real, I love that. That's my all-time favorite book on the subject. I can't recommend it enough. And there's a section in there where he deals with the Dutch Reformed scholastic Gespertus Vocis. Gespertus Vocis was a delegate to the Synod of Dort and was one of the most prominent scholastic theologians in the Dutch Reformed Church. And Gespertus Vocis has a concept. He illustrates the concepts of synchronic contingency with the phrase simultaneity of potencies. And what he means by that is what I just articulated, namely that, you have the ability to do different things at the same time. And when you actualize one potency, that doesn't remove the contrary potency. The fact that you have those two contrary potencies, notice the word potencies, not two actualities, two potencies, existing simultaneously when one of them is actualized is what grounds the action as free and contingent. Even though God has eternally decreed, for example, for Socrates to sit, that doesn't, nonetheless, if we consider Socrates in himself, in his own human nature, he is contingent, and therefore he's free. He's not being forced or coerced. It's not like God's pointing a gun at his head and forcing him to run. No, he still has the potency towards the contrary act, and therefore it's free and contingent. To give an example of this in the Thomist tradition, Thomas Aquinas in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 73 says, quote, "On the other hand, it is owing to the perfection of the will that it is a contingent cause, because its power is not confined to one effect." Notice that language. It's not confined to one effect. And it is in its power to produce this effect or that effect, so that it is indifferent to either. Therefore, it belongs to divine providence to preserve the freedom of the will more than contingency and natural causes. So right there, you have Aquinas himself is saying exactly what the Reformed are saying, which shows that there's this continuity between them.
Excellent. Okay. Interview over. Thank you all for watching. I'm just kidding. So that's your rundown. There. And to be completely honest, I'm not sure where to go on from that. But to really just quickly whip it off the top of my head. Why do these? Where do you see these distinctions being missed and violated in, let's say just a random provisionist critique of how big bad Calvinist God treats everyone like a puppet? Where do you see in their articulations of what the Reformed tradition believes, where do you see the missing of those key elements that you have discussed? What do they drop the ball on, I guess?
Well, I don't mean to be rude to our provisionist friends, but to be quite honest, they don't seem to have any familiarity with scholastic distinctions at all. So I've never even heard them address them to begin with. And I don't really listen to a lot of provisionists, to be honest.
That's fair enough.
I mean, I've listened to some. I mean, it gets tiring after a while. I mean, no offense. But yeah, I mean, I don't think they really deal with these types of distinctions that much. And I think if they could just grasp, for example, the distinction between hypothetical necessity and absolute necessity, or what I dealt with a minute ago, necessity of the consequent, necessity of the consequence. If they could grasp that basic distinction, that would move the Reformed provisionist dialogue miles ahead. And we would be asking totally different questions. We'd be having totally different debates, and we wouldn't just be talking past each other all the time. So in terms of, I couldn't give you like a specific example of them dropping the ball, but I think the fact that they always accuse us of saying that God is the author of sin, which I would love to deal with that in a minute. I mean, and using the thing I've laid out from the Reformed and Thomist tradition, you can easily tear that argument to shreds. So, yeah, I mean, I think just the general provisionist unfamiliarity with the scholastic tradition, whether within Aquinas, within Scotus, or within the Reformers and their successors, they don't really address these sorts of distinctions at all. And that's why they fundamentally misunderstand the Reformed tradition's teaching on this issue.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned again the necessity of the consequent versus necessity of the consequence distinction, because that one, even when I first heard of it, I read explanations and I was still going, okay, what the heck does that mean? When I first heard of it, that one, as you said, is a key in moving the debate forward. So you've explained it earlier. Could you go into more detail with that, and perhaps especially with practical examples of what is a necessity of the consequent versus of the consequence?
Yeah, so I would just let me ask you a question in terms take this proposition. If God wills that Bob goes to the store, is it possible for Bob not to go to the store?
In that would
you say yes or no?
In that he has the potentia to go to the store still, or not go to the store rather?
Exactly. That's what I was getting at. So in a sense, we can using that distinction about necessity, and also another distinction. There's a lot of distinctions. Another distinction between opposed and divided senses of a conditional proposition, such as what I just gave you. We can say, in a sense, yes, it is possible for Bob not to go to the store. not in the sense that he could act against God's decree. God forbid, that would be blasphemous. But no, in the sense that Bob still possesses the innate potency to not go to the store, because he's not a brute animal who acts on instinct. He's a rational agent with the faculties of intellect and the faculty of will. And therefore, he's not. And like I said, like what Aquinas rightly said, the perfection of the will lies in the fact that it's not confined to one effect. It's not confined to one particular action to the exclusion of others. So yes, in a sense, Bob cannot go to the store, even though God decrees him to, if we consider Bob in his secondary causality as a human free agent with synchronic contingency and simultaneous potencies. But if we take into account the divine decree, then no, Bob will go to the store, because God will not move the human will to perform anything other than what he has decreed for it to perform.
Okay, great. Does this one affect, because actually this one I've been a bit curious of as well, because I recognize even a lot of people who identify as Arminian will not quite get into the full depths of classical Arminianism. Does that issue affect debates with classical Arminians a whole ton, or not really?
Yeah, it definitely can. I believe Arminius at least mentions that. I mean, Arminius knew the distinction between necessity of the consequent and necessity of the consequent. So I believe in his book against William Perkins, I think Arminius mentions it at one time or another. I don't remember his exact response to it. I mean, I know the way Molina addresses these sorts of distinctions, the way Molina addresses it, and I would argue that Molina and Arminius are on the same team with this debate. The way Molina addresses it is basically by saying that this distinction between the composed and divided senses, which I just gave you, like where we consider God's decree, or if we just consider the human agent in himself in se, in terms of the fact that he's not confined to one particular effect. Molina responds and just says, well, that just reduces just to simply saying God could do anything God could do otherwise. It doesn't actually resort to humans being able to do otherwise. However, Molina contradicts himself by using that same distinction a couple pages later. It's in his part 4 of his Concordia, to be exact.
Okay, fair enough. I don't know if I intend to read that anytime soon, but in any event,
don't waste your time. I read it so you don't have to. It's trash.
I've already got
it's not good. Like, yeah,
right.
Horrible.
I've already got William Lane Craig and Tim Stratton's books on that.
That's even worse.
I was gonna say.
Yeah. Well, interesting. There's an interesting thing about William Lane Craig in that book, Foreknowledge and Human Freedom. I believe there's a page where William Lane Craig explicitly says that the idea that God's middle knowledge is prior to his decree, which is literally the entire point of Molinism. He says that's nowhere. Actually, you can't really make a biblical argument in support of that. So William Lane Craig says that. But that's neither here nor there, though.
So he's a Molinist, but not a Molinist. Okay, interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Why?
He does DIY.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Basically, the Frankensteinian school of Molinism, I guess.
Yeah.
But in any event, why does this? So we have this very heavy-handed scholastic language where we can speak of the simultaneous reality of the absolute necessity of God's will, but at the same time, and that can't be contravened, and yet at the same time, there's still as you say, there's still the potentia within, or the potential, just to use English language for others watching. There's still the potential within the agent who must follow the decree, but there's still the potential within him to do otherwise. How do you think that this bites back against the accusation of God being the author of evil? What meaningful difference does this make? Because one thing I'll hear from, whether it's regular people who are just listening to this debate, or especially from provisionists, is they'll say that this is just very highbrow, lofty, scholastic language that doesn't actually have any effect. So what real world meaning does this distinction have on the accusation of God being the author of evil?
Yeah. So I'd say two things here. In terms of biblical support, the example I like to use that is also used by Peter Martyr Vermigli is the analogy of when Christ is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the Jews and the Sanhedrin are coming to arrest him. one of the things that our Lord says to them is he says that it is possible that the Son of Man could be saved by a legion of angels. And, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, and then he would not suffer death. So Christ is saying that it's possible for him to be saved from death and not be crucified. Yet at the same time, we read in the book of Acts that this was the definite foreknowledge and counsel of God that the Jews would kill Jesus. There's going to be some people accuse me of anti-Semitism for that later. But like,
it doesn't matter.
I mean, the fact, therefore, it's just, yeah, but that's the thing though, is like the fact that Christ himself tells us that it is possible for him not to be crucified, and yet at the same time, this event was eternally decreed by God.
Right.
That right there, you have synchronic contingency in biblical terms. It was God decreed it. On the other hand, if you consider the event in itself, in its own nature, it's contingent. It's not absolutely intrinsically necessary that it happen, but God decreed it, so it's a necessity of the consequence. In terms of God being the author of sin and that whole issue, I'd respond to it the same way Domingo Banez answers it, which is he makes the distinction between when we take the act of sin, we have to distinguish sin as a positive entity, such that it's just an act. We don't think about, is it a good act or an evil act? It's just an act, right? Sin as a positive entity versus sin qua sin, like the malice of sin. It's rebellion against the law of God, which is the formal nature of sin, which makes it to be sin. And he says that when God moves the human will, for example, when God moves a person to commit adultery or fornication or murder, something like that, they're moved towards the act of sin as a positive entity, and just the act considered as an act, right? An act qua act. But God is not the author of sin, because the malice of sin, that lack of conformity to the law of God, comes only and solely from the human creature, right? So God is not the author of sin in that sense. And a good analogy would be like, if there's a disabled man who, has a limping problem, and when he walks, he can do nothing but limp. If I move him to walk in some way, then when he limps, that's not my fault. I moved him to walk, but the fact that he's limping is because of a defect in his body, in his own nature, such that he will do nothing but limp. And so in the same way, when God moves the human will towards the act of sin, that's only in terms of sin's positive entity as an act. It's not sin qua sin.
Okay. To raise another potential objection with that, and one I've even heard from people who are more scholastically minded but don't like the reformed articulation of this issue, they may respond with, okay, that's fair enough, but the problem is, if you bring them back just a few more steps, you see that even with God's decree, he decreed their nature or their will or what have you to be such that they would have that limp. And so even if temporally speaking, at a later time, they're already limping, and God didn't cause it at that immediate time, he did cause it when going back to the beginning of cause. And therefore, in that sense, especially given the rejection of middle knowledge, that therefore sin really did originate in the mind and the decree of God, therefore making him the author of sin. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. So are you asking, how does God will sin?
Right, pretty much. Yeah. And him not be the author of sin. Will it in the sense of it comes about to be in the world that he decrees.
Yeah. Yeah, so the standard Reformed answer is that God wills the permission of evil by what we would call a second order volition. And by second order volition, it's not like a positive, intensive act of God whereby he is willing sin as sin. God wills and decrees that sin occur, all right, that sin will happen. But that does not make God the author of sin, because when we say second order volition, it just means in the sense that God is choosing, for example, to withhold the grace that would make a person be able to avoid sin, right? So if a person commits sin, that's not God directly, positively willing it. I mean, he wills that it occur. I talked about the positive entity of sin, right? That's clear. But God is willing by second order volition to not give them efficacious grace such that they wouldn't sin. And then Arminians will retort back, and Arminius actually uses this exact objection. He says, well, if God withholds that grace without which we cannot avoid sin, then God is responsible. To which I would retort back with Samuel Rutherford, why is God obligated to give us this grace? Why is God obligated to do that? That's a presupposition that's underlying Arminius' whole argument, is that God is obligated to give grace such that we would avoid sin. And I would say, why is he obligated to do that? God is not constrained by creation.
Okay, yeah, that does make a very good point. I think that also gets into the problem of the equal ultimacy type problem that you'll hear from a number of reformed, where they'll treat that God's decree or movement of man's will in the direction of grace is exactly the same as reprobation, as if they're the exact same kind of act. When
I would say
exactly. When, as you described, it's really one is positive, but the other one's more of a privation that inevitably leads to disaster. And so there is a meaningful distinction in that one. And I think I wonder if you'd agree on that, because obviously I can still see, and I have seen it explained to non-Calvinists, quote unquote, that basically kind of logic, but they still have a great, at least a great personal objection to that possibly being the case, and they'll still think God is the author of sin in that respect. Are there beyond that explanation you've given, are there more steps? Are there more, shall we say, more distinctions and more steps to take that further demonstrate God to not be the author of sin, or is that just something where, look, it stops here and it's basically a question now of people's presuppositions, especially moral and ethical presuppositions, of whether they think that's acceptable for God to do or not? Do you reckon the buck kind of stops there, or does it keep going?
Yeah. So your question here reminds me of kind of what you said earlier. Like, Arminians would retort back by saying, well, didn't God decree that they would have a nature that is predisposed towards sin, or something like that? And the way I would think about it is that if we go to why people are sinful, it ultimately goes back to original sin, the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which is imputed. That guilt is transmitted to Adam's descendants, his posterity, and that the act of that sin is imputed to them as well, Romans 5:12. Unless, of course, you're Pelagian, as many provisionists are, which is the reason why people like Leighton Flowers openly deny the imputation of Adam's sin, as does the provisionist perspective, if I'm not mistaken. And the thing that I would say is that in the Garden of Eden, Adam had the ability to sin or to not sin, right? He had that simultaneous potencies that we talked about towards sin or not sinning. The cause of Adam's sin is solely from his own will. That's the standard Reformed answer. I can give you some quotes on this if you want, from people like, I think, Francis Turretin addresses this, that like it's the will of man that caused him to sin in Eden, and therefore that since that act of sin is imputed to his posterity, the fact that they have a sinful nature is of their own fault. That the impotency of man towards spiritual good that's culpable on him. That's not to be blamed on God in any way. Like, by way of analogy, like, say for example that you have a master and a servant, and the servant gets drunk and is no longer able to perform his master's commands. Does that mean that the servant, due to him being drunk and his mental faculties are clouded and he's not able to perform well anymore, does that mean that the servant is suddenly free from culpability? I think everyone would say no. Molina actually does say yes. That means he's free from culpability, by the way, which is just like, I don't know how anyone in their right mind can say that, but
that explains everything about the Jesuits. Incredible.
I mean, yeah, seriously, Jesuit tricks every day. I mean, it's
every day.
I mean, Molina says that, like, he would say that, if you're in that condition, you're not culpable anymore, which is just stupid. I mean, no one. I think it's just by way of the light of nature and common reason, we would all agree that a drunken man is still culpable for his actions, even if he's not in the right mind of reasoning and thinking at that time. So that when the fall, after the fall, when man is born with original sin and actual sin and concupiscence and that predisposition towards evil, until, of course, God heals the will and makes the will to desire that which is good. That is man's fault. That's not God's fault. So, and I think the analogy of the drunken man kind of helps illustrate that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I have to agree with that. And we have Eli Ayala, Revealed Apologetics. Yes, Dr. Craig does say it, or what you were mentioning before about what he denies from Molina. It can't be defending use of scripture, but that we should believe it unless there is good reason to deny it, lol. I don't buy Molinism one bit. Been there, done that, and bought the T-shirt. Same here. Once upon a time. Although,
Yeah,
in fairness,
the basic problem, the basic problem with Molinism is that it assumes that something can be actualized apart from the divine decree and the divine will. That's why they say middle knowledge comes before, like, because in theology we do make a distinction between what we call God's necessary knowledge and his free knowledge. God's necessary knowledge is where he knows his own essence, he knows all possibilities, and God's free knowledge is where he is foreknowledge, where he knows what he has decreed, and he knows what will be actualized. He knows things actual. And middle knowledge is supposed to be this thing that can be actualized simply by virtue of the human free choice apart from the divine decree. And what Molinists don't realize is that they're falling into the exact same pit which they're trying to avoid, namely fatalism. And the reason why I say that is because, remember, Molinism, it's things can be actualized apart from divine decree. In this case, the human will is already intrinsically predisposed towards choosing this particular thing under this set of circumstances, right? So that removes the indifference of the human will, that innate indifference with respect to secondary causality that exists in the human will, which is what we use to ground man's freedom and contingency. Molinism does away with that in order to come up with this concept of the scientia media, and says that and that's why they even say that God's middle knowledge is ultimately it corresponds to the free choices of man. Like, you can change God's middle knowledge is pretty much what you would say, which also denies that God is pure act because he's in potency to something external to himself. So the entire Molinist system just leads to like denying important attributes of God. That's why I said it's a heretical theology proper. And it also leads to fatalism because, as I said,
and that actually, what that goes on to show is, well, actually, it's not merely a question, and it's no longer anymore just a question of what's man's free will, how does God predestine stuff, but as you say, it actually touches on the very question of the attributes of God, like how is he composed in the abstract sense. So what would you say then, I guess in more detail from what you were already mentioning, how would you say that these realities of the Reformed tradition, as you explain it, distinction between necessity of consequence versus of consequent, that there are synchronic contingencies, that there is the absolute necessity that God's will would be followed through, but there is still the innate, considered in itself the innate potentia of an agent doing otherwise. How does that then retroactively inform our doctrine of God, and how does the denial of such likewise mutate our doctrine of God?
Yeah, so the whole point is that, and this gets into the issue of what's called physical premotion, which I mentioned earlier, which is that in order for a human creature to act at all, God must move him to act, right? So God has to move the human will from a state of potency to a state of actuality. And this is taught almost explicitly by Aquinas and later articulated further by Domingo Banez. And then it's brought over in the Reformed tradition. One name off the top of my head in the Reformed tradition that many will know is John Owen, my favorite of the English Puritans. And John Owen very clearly teaches this Thomist concept of physical premotion. And it's in volume 10 of his works, his book against the Arminians. And physical premotion just means that it's an influx of efficient causality such that the human will is able now to act. And the fact that this physical premotion is necessary, I think, can be illustrated by way of analogy. Say you have an axe, right? Which of its nature, that axe can be used for cutting wood because it has the sharpened edge. So it has that form, that substantial form in it so that it can cut wood. However, the axe has to be moved by an external source. It has to be actualized by something outside, by something external, such as a lumberjack, in order to actually cut the wood. And so that the human will works in a similar way, right? We have those that perfection of the will such that we're not confined to one effect, but we don't just sit in that little abstract state of potency, little bubble doing nothing. No, in order for us to actually act, God has to move the will such that it will act. In terms of a biblical support, I think Philippians 2:13 is good, where it says that God works within us both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And how that relates to our doctrine of God is, like I said earlier about Molinism, that nothing is actualized apart from the divine decree. Anything that takes place, anything that is moved from potency to act, has to be done by something that is already in act, and that is God, because God is pure act. He's the fully actualized being. There is no passive potency in God. That's a Socinian heresy. And that is why God is able to move the human will to act. And I gave the analogy of earlier how that doesn't mean that God's the author of sin, because we have to distinguish between the positive entity of sin as it's an act and the malice of sin, such that it is a rebellion against God's law that makes it to be sin, formally speaking.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Over the centuries, with this understanding, actually, no, even before that, because you're mentioning again pure act here, or actus puros, I guess. And that's one that, as soon as I heard you say that, I had it ringing in my head. The many J. Dyer clips of going raging against pure act, and so I guess this goes into objections, not just from like provisionists or Arminians of many different stripes, but even from the Eastern side. So where do you see the error, therefore? I guess it's kind of implicitly what you said before, but to, I guess, bring it more explicitly, where do you see the error in the reasons why there is a denial, especially from the East, of pure act? I guess as well as even from the modern anti-scholastic reform types like James White, because I've heard him kind of mock the concept a bit as well, if memory serves correct. Where do their reasonings against the concept err, and where does, if they're right, what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, so I think one thing that one popular misconception against the idea of God as pure act is basically they think this makes God some sort of static, abstract Aristotelian thing, right? Because their whole thing is really old. That boils down as just, what hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? That famous thing that Tertullian said. That's really their rallying cry. And that influences the way they think about really all of theology, which has horrible consequences, as we've seen in the past 3 years of the Reformed Baptist civil war over Aquinas and his influence. And the main reason is that ultimately, if you deny that God is pure act, that implies an imperfection in God, because you're implying something in God that is becoming like greater than it already is. So that also subjects God to time, means that he's temporally contained. So I would really like to put it this way: saying that God is pure act is just a fancy way of saying that God is perfect and that there's no imperfection in him.
Right, fair enough. I guess, well, when you put it in that much more simple way, it just means God's perfect. Well, I guess it's kind of obvious to everyone what happens you say when you say God's not perfect. Well, unless you're an open theist, in which you say, okay, but that's, I guess,
they don't
at
even
that
get
point,
a seat at the table.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's just like, okay, you can go sit in the kids' corner over there while the adults in the room discuss. No, there's some smart open theists out there, but it's like, let's just look. In terms of our conception of Christianity, it's just not there, period.
Yeah.
But in any event, that does make a lot of sense. And when you bringing up the Reformed Baptist Civil War on Aquinas, oh man, that has been so fun to watch, because I actually do sympathize with both sides in different senses. Where on one hand, I actually sympathize a lot more, quite a bit more with James White than pretty much almost everybody else I associate with in these matters. Maybe even more than you, I don't know. Where I do grant, because I was raised like this, and even though I've shaven off a lot of the excesses, I still do appreciate that it is very possible and a very real danger for people to impute scholastic, Aristotelian, Platonic, whatever, name X philosophical school out there, Vedanta Hinduism, whatever, where it's entirely possible for people to impute categories on scripture that are actually foreign to it. So on that sense, I sympathize greatly with James White. On the other hand, I sympathize with the pro-scholastic side of this debate, because whatever you think the mistakes of Aquinas and others are, there's still plenty of great stuff to be retrieved there. And even if you disagree with the conclusions, just the way with which those older scholastics argued, the way in which they made arguments, the way they dealt with issues, is something that genuinely needs to be retrieved. So again, not even all the conclusions necessarily, but just the method of, well, how methodical they were with these matters, and being able to categorize things with clear terms and definitions and being able to argue that way, rather than just going over vagaries like Calvinism and the author of evil and other borderline meaningless terms like that. So in that respect, I guess, does how do I frame this one? How would you estimate the damage of the so actually you know what, do you, if you happen to know the history about this, if you don't, that's fine. Where did historically the ball start to drop with respect to the reform, those in the Reformed traditions and the traditional Reformed denominations? Where did the ball start to drop? Where they eventually started to reject a lot more than they should have of scholasticism, and that just led to the wholesale rejection, and that's a lot of problems. Where historically did that begin?
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard to pinpoint exact place, but I mean, I think maybe you see some roots of it in the Enlightenment, perhaps. But I'd say if there's one particular figure that I see this, who's a guy that's commonly hailed as some Reformed hero, but who really just pushed this tendency hard, it's Cornelius vantil. And Cornelius vantil openly criticized the Reformed scholastics, saying that they were too philosophically influenced. And it's interesting that's around the same time in the 20th century where you see this decline in how in Reformed theological method that you start seeing the rise of Catholic answers and all the conversions to Roman Catholicism and in Eastern Orthodoxy in turn. I think that there is some correlation there. I mean, it's interesting that if you go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, the Protestants defecting to Rome was not as common as you see it today. Today, I think it's one of the reasons it's so common is because, like you said, the ball started rolling with this attitude of biblicism among the Reformed, which was not only just an obscure theological method, but a departing from the Reformed tradition altogether, and the way that they argued about theology, the way that the Reformers were able to refute the Papists and the Eastern Orthodox and and the Muslims and the Jews and all these different groups was through rigorous study of primary sources. I mean, you see that Renaissance tendency there, going back to the sources. That's the way that the Reformed were arguing. They were not just dealing with abstract concepts and interpreting the Bible in a vacuum.
Completely true. Completely true. Actually, we have another potential objection here from Ulysses people. I was always under the impression that people deny pure act because if God was pure act, then he would create by necessity of what he is. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So this is what's known as the modal collapse argument against divine simplicity. It's a very popular objection. You know, people like Ryan Mullins and a lot of the soy boy analytic theologians like to use it. The basic way to answer it, I'm sorry, I just can't stand those guys who do like the DIY.
Hey, feel free. I've said worse things in this channel. Trust me.
I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, like the thing about with this objection is that I would say you need to distinguish the act as it exists in God ad intra versus the termination of that act ad extra. So and I think this also applies to the divine decree when God has an act, for example, like creating the world. That act is identical to God's essence as it exists ad intra. But the termination of that act, the actual effects in time of the world being created, is something that's contingent. It's ad extra. It's not absolutely necessary. And therefore, God is not constrained down to create the world. I mean, God could have not created the world if he wanted to. Right. You just have to distinguish like the eternal, like, and this also applies, like people have asked, like, could God have decreed could God have decreed that, for example, World War II never happened? And the answer is yes. God was not absolutely necessitated towards decreeing that World War II happened. The distinction we have to make is the decree considered as it is the immanent will of God ad intra, identical to the divine essence, and then versus distinguishing the decree as it tends to the objects being decreed ad extra, right? That ad intra, ad extra language. Ad intra just simply means in God. Ad extra means outside God, external to God. And that's that distinction is really, really important, and it will be very, very useful. And so that's how I would respond to that, is using that ad intra, ad extra distinction.
Sure. To put on my own, I guess, modal collapse argument enjoyer or fan soy boy shoes, I guess something, even though I'm not madly familiar with this matter, but just from just intuitively, I can imagine them replying that, okay, fair enough, you have a distinction between God's will and decree, ad intra versus ad extra. But the problem is, does not the ad extra likewise flow from the ad intra? And so should not, therefore, the result still be the same of God creating by necessity of what he is? If I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, I mean, it is true that the ad extra result is necessary, but we go back to the distinction about necessity of the consequent versus necessity of the consequence. It's necessary by necessity of the consequence. It's not an absolute necessity. Because if you consider that event in itself, according to secondary causality, it's contingent. So you see that these distinctions that we're making about free will also apply to distinctions we make about the works and acts of God as well. The acts of God ad extra, and it answers all sorts of arguments. That's why I think learning these sorts of basic concepts just helps immensely with all areas of theology.
Right, absolutely. And even just from my own intuitive type of response, we also got to account for the fact that God does in the end have a will. He is an intelligence. He's not he's not the whatchamacallit. He's not like the Platonic or Plotinus's
the one
that just oozes out essence without intelligence. It's not like it's not an unintelligent divine ooze that just pours things out exactly
like
according
the
to what it is.
And the world soul. Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like that. It's God does have a will. He does have an intelligence. So he's pure act. He's all perfection and what have you. But he still has a will. At which point, again, the nice the inner biblicist in me just likes to say, it's a mystery. Who cares? Why did God decree this way and not the other way? Who cares? He just did. That's pretty much what.
That's fine as well. It was God will to do so. God will to do so. I refuse to elaborate further. Yeah,
exactly. God, why is this the case? God did it. Refuses to elaborate. Leaves. That's how every discussion in the end needs to end here. And that is a meaningful thing. It's not like a God of the gaps. Oh, God did it. No elaboration, whatever. Cope type of argument. Because if you're going to object to that, you basically have to demonstrate that you know the inner workings of God. Which, to slow down and say that back to yourself, yes, I know how God works in his innermost parts, that this would not be the case. Okay,
innermost parts.
Anyway. I'm kidding. Just speaking in a generic sense. But anyway, with respect to that, are there any other areas of the Reformed tradition of free will you'd like to elaborate on, or have you more or less said what you think needs to be said?
Yeah, so I think it'd be good to talk more about how it's in continuity with Aquinas. One area would be when we ask, we said that the will is contingent, and we've given why it's contingent, but another important factor is that God has decreed it to be contingent. In other words, God has decreed that you act freely. That sounds like a contradiction in terms. I'm actually going to just send this quote to you in the private chat because I think it's interesting. But that's from the Westminster Divine William Twiss said this, quote, "We say with Aquinas, God's will is so efficacious as to cause all things to come to pass after such a manner as they do come to pass, to wit, necessary things necessarily and contingent things contingently or freely, whether in good or evil," end quote. That's from one of the leading theologians of the Westminster Assembly, openly, explicitly appropriating Aquinas to answer how it is that the will is contingent and how the divine will relates to that reality. So I could go on for hours about this because the continuity between Aquinas and the Reformed tradition on this issue is very, very clear. Richard Muller demonstrates that, I think, pretty conclusively in his book, Divine Will and Human Choice.
I forgot to take this off. Yeah. And even from the very little I've explored on this issue, I'd have to agree. And so, there is continuity between Aquinas. Actually, no, you just mentioned it. Divine Will and Human Choice. So that's a book you recommend. Do you want to jump to book recommendations now, or other issues to tackle, or?
Well, I wanted to ask: is there any questions in the audience? Any more?
Yeah. We're gonna be doing that. I'm gonna go first. We'll go first with the book recommendations. So please drop us your book recommendations.
Okay. Yeah, so I've already mentioned this one, Divine Will and Human Choice by Richard Muller. This is, in my opinion, the best book ever written on the subject of predestination and free choice and how they relate to each other. And this isn't really a polemical work. It's more of a historical theological work. It's in historical theology. That's the realm it deals with. But what Richard Muller does in that book is he uses that concept of synchronic contingency, and he traces it all throughout the Reformed tradition, from starting with John Calvin, then other figures like Franciscus Junius, John Owen, Gisberdus Vocis, William Twiss, who I just mentioned, Franciscus Gomaris, Jerome Zanchi. He was an Italian reformer. And he traces this all throughout the Reformed tradition. And then he also has another chapter showing how these little concepts go back all the way back to Aristotle himself. And then you see him baptized in Aquinas, as they like to say. And then Scotus fleshes it out even more. And so right before the Reformation starts, you already have this rich tradition with all these distinctions. And then the Reformed take that tradition and use it as the sword to defeat Arminianism.
Based, very based. And real quick, before you go on your next book, people, we're going to be having Q&A in just a few minutes. So hang on, where's the correct banner? Right here. There we go. So yeah, Q&A happening in a few minutes. So get your questions, load them up right now. I do not see any others. Actually, I see one question that we have, but since it's not there's not a massive queue of questions, unlike when I have someone like, say, James White or Gavin Orlin on the channel. So get your questions in, and we can definitely get to your question. So keep going.
Yeah. The next one I'd recommend is this book here that's called, if you can see that, Divine Causality and Human Free Choice by Ryan J. Matava. This is also a historical theological study. It's published by Brill, so you know it's going to be good. It's on Domingo Banez, physical premotion, and the De Auxiliis controversy. So this isn't really as much about the Reformed tradition, but if you want to get an in-depth account of how the Thomists refuted the Molinists on the subject of free choice, how the intellect and the will relate to one another, middle knowledge. There's a whole section on middle knowledge in here that's really, really good. That is the best resource that I know of on that issue. And it's dealing specifically with Domingo Banez, who, as I mentioned earlier, was the Spanish Dominican Thomist theologian, one of the leading opponents of Luis de Molina during the late 16th century. And he himself, Banez himself, actually wrote a commentary on prima pars of the Summa of Aquinas. So Banez knew his stuff, and I think Banez's account is really just the Reformed tradition, but with just a little extra sauce added on top. So it's really, really good. I love that book.
Nice. All right.
All right. Next book?
Yep. Just keep going. Smash through them.
Okay. Yeah. So this is more about predestination than it is about free will, but I think it also has some important stuff in it. This is a book by Dr. Joel Beeke, who I've had the privilege of being able to hear preach in person. Joel Beeke's one of the only Reformed theologians today that I know that is actually confessional and is actually knows the Reformed tradition. I mean, his whole PhD was on post-Reformation theology and English Puritanism and that sort of thing. And so this book is called Debated Issues in Sovereign Predestination. And then that little subtitle there is Early Lutheran Predestination, Calvinian Reprobation, and Variations in Genevan Lapsarianism. So obviously that's a mouthful of a subtitle, but this really deals with how did the Lutherans think about predestination? The Formula of Concord, Martin Chemnitz, these early Lutheran divines, and how does that relate to kind of the Lutheran Reformed dialogue that you see in the mid to late 16th century? And then it has a whole section on John Calvin's doctrine of reprobation, how it is that God does predestine some men for eternal destruction. And then that last part is on the infra and supralapsarianism debate, which has to do with the logical ordering of God's decrees. I think this book is good as a background. I mean, obviously, it's not about free choice in particular, but obviously the whole debate about free choice is viewed in light of the doctrine of predestination. That's what the alleged conflict between these two doctrines is what's given rise to the debate in the first place. So I think reading on both of those different issues will help with that. And I thought I'd give one book from a contrary perspective, like the other side of the chasm. And that is some collected writings of Jacob Arminius. And the reason why I give this one is because Arminius argues much better than the provisionists do. Arminius actually knows about scholasticism, and he's willing to deal with some of those difficult questions. And in particular, I would read Arminius's Declaration of Sentiments. That's where he kind of gives a summary of his arguments. I believe, I'm trying to remember when that was published. I think that was maybe 1605. Like Arminius died in 1609. 10 years later, the Synod of Dort happened. So sometime in like that first decade of the 17th century, Arminius published that, which was kind of his views on things like predestination, free choice, sufficient grace, efficacious grace, and that sort of thing. But then the more in-depth account from Arminius is his response to William Perkins. William Perkins was one of the early English Puritans, one of the few who remained in the Church of England, actually. And Arminius wrote this response to Perkins' book on predestination and grace. And then in turn, there's other Reformed scholastics that responded back to Arminius and destroyed every argument he made.
Just casually, his entire life's work just annihilated. But do you also recommend? Actually, no. Do you also recommend this one by Muller as well? Providence, Freedom, and the Will in Early Modern Reformed Theology. And what's the what? I haven't. I've been wanting to pick up the Divine Will and Human Freedom one as well. But what's the actual difference between the two? Because
as far as I know, I really thought about buying that book, but I didn't. And the reason why is because, as far as I know from looking at the table of contents, if my memory serves me right, I think Muller is more dealing with specific Reformed theologians. It's not as broad. And so, don't get me wrong, I recommend anything written by Richard Muller. So sure, I'd recommend that book, but I haven't actually read it.
One of my good Sydney Anglican mates, maybe he's watching right now or afterwards, but he's gotten us all to refer to him basically as Saint Muller, pretty much. So, and his writing is quite canonical, you might say, perhaps even deuterocanonical. But yeah, you're right. Looking at the table of contents, I've read bits of it as well, but yeah, pretty much all just goes with the Reform guys from Vermigli, Beza, Arminius down to Charnock and Edwards. So yeah, it pretty much is a focus on that. So definitely recommend that as well. This has been cool. Here's one from Dalton. Stanglin's book, Muller's Pupil, is a good in-depth take that deals with the scholastic approach. I think Father James also recommended it.
Yeah, Stanglin, I believe he's referring to Keith Stanglin. Keith Stanglin is probably the best scholar on Arminius today. He's written several books on Arminius. So he's pretty solid. If I remember correctly, he wrote a book on Arminius's view of the assurance of salvation, which I read a teeny bit of. But I've read like an essay by Keith Stanglin, which was talking about Arminius's doctrine of the twofold love of God, which is something that's never really been found ever before in theology. Arminius just kind of, I don't want to say made it up out of thin air, because maybe it's found somewhere, but Arminius used this concept a lot to try to refute unconditional election. So yeah, Stanglin's a good scholar in Arminius, and Richard Muller would probably recommend him since he was his pupil, as the comment says. So
yeah, it's a pretty blessed for one to be within the line of succession from Muller.
The apostolic succession of Richard Muller. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is itself a concept derived of from the succession of the philosophers, which is a whole other issue to get into. But in any event, that for a completely different stream than now. But in any event, so would that be all your book recommendations on this?
Yeah, I believe so for now. Yeah.
Excellent. All right, people, Q&A time. So it looks like we have a couple of questions so far. Put in more questions, because these are not going to be, I don't suspect these will take very long to answer, given Matt's very wide reading on this issue. So if you want the questions to be answered by Muller's mini-me right now, then by all means, please send them here. So, starting with, how would you compare and contrast Orthodox Lutheran view of the will versus the Reformed Orthodox view?
Yeah, so to be honest, I'm not as familiar with the Lutheran view of free choice as I am with the Lutheran view of predestination. And so I could comment more on predestination than I could on the will. And with regard to that, I think one distinctive is that the Formula of Concord basically rejects the doctrine of reprobation altogether. Whereas the Reformed would not. We do teach it. I believe that Scripture teaches it. And in general, I think that one distinctive of Lutheran theology in general, and I would think this would apply to the issue of free choice, as the comment mentions, and predestination, is that they view everything in a hyper-pastoral context. So they really only want to talk about election insofar as it can be used for comforting weak consciences, which, it's fine. You should always view theology in a pastoral context. I think they should be praised for that. But I think they do it to the overemphasis of not actually addressing some of those deeper issues. But in terms of the Orthodox Lutheran view of free choice, I believe that there would be people like Johann Gerhardt who would address it in his theological commonplaces. But yeah, to be honest, I've read more of the Arminian perspective on free choice, and the Jesuit, the Molinist, and the Thomist, and of course the Reformed, my own tradition on it, than I have on Lutherans, to be honest. So
fair enough. Maybe people would want to. I wonder if our you know the Scholastic Lutherans.
Yeah.
I wonder if they've done any work on that. So if you want to, I don't know. I guess if you want to see what Matt has said here in this stream, look at and by the way, people, he, as I was going to say at the very end, but his paper on the issue is linked in the description below. Go read it. Very good, very in depth. So if you look at what Matt said in this stream, what he's written, as well as what Muller has written, but ultimately, of course, insofar as they reflect what the actual Reformed writers themselves have written. So that should always be a primary objective of reading. Do that. Go check out other people like the Scholastic Lutherans or other people who are inclined to that, as well as the classical Lutheran sources themselves. And I guess you'll find your answer there after a few years, maybe. But in any event, it'll happen. My man Javier, who needs to watch the Super Bowl when we can talk about free will? Am I right, broskies? So true. And as an Australian, I could not care less about the Super Bowl. I care about the rugby league, which is just about to start. So that's just me. Eula's pupil, would the entity of sin be considered good in itself?
No. It also wouldn't be considered evil in itself. It's a positive. It's an entity. It's just an entity. So by definition, we wouldn't make a judge. But when we're considering it as an entity, we're not bearing in mind. We're abstracting it from its consideration as it's good or evil. We're just considering it as a bare, naked act.
Right, yeah. But you wouldn't say like sin exists, properly speaking, right? Because as far as I'm aware, existence is it is a perfection in Thomism.
Yeah, so no. So sin is right. We would say that like sin at least is the privation of evil. Although one aspect in Reformed theology is that one issue with Roman Catholicism is that they make original sin to consist only in the privation of evil, whereas we would agree with that, but we would also say that concupiscence, which is something that's more positive, a sense of like a predisposition towards evil, we would say that concupiscence is also a sin, which is one of the disagreements we have with Roman Catholicism. But I guess you could consider a thing can be called a privation in respect to different things. I believe that Gispertus Vocis discusses this in his treatise on how original sin is transmitted from parents to offspring. So I refer you to him. Obviously, they would explain it much better than I could about how the entity of sin, properly speaking, yes, we could think of it as a privation, but it can be considered an entity with respect to something else.
Fair enough. Does Matt have a YouTube channel by chance?
Yes, I do. I'll send you a link in the private chat.
Yeah, you should have told me about that at the start. I'm going to have to edit the description after the fact to add it now.
Oh, yes. I have my blog as well, if you want to put that there. I'm not trying to get soliciting here, but
no, man, I'm all about promoting the boys when we have them on stream.
Yeah, I have a couple. I have one video about William Albrecht and some other stuff, but and the Council of Ephesus it's just iconography was the video that I did that one about.
That's right. Yeah. I also you should definitely upload more, do more on this. I reckon people would very much appreciate this kind of content. It's not really appreciated by a lot of people. So people, I will put these right now in the live chat. So that's his channel there. And this is his, when it decides to post. There we go. And that is his blogspot. So that should come up in a second in the live chat. So there's your answer to that. He does indeed have online content, which people can go and check out. Now, another one from Eula's pupil. Why is an active potency considered an act and not a potency?
Because by definition, an active potency is actualized.
Nice and quick. Another one from the same man. Sorry. What are your thoughts on the objection that God is not pure act in Reformed theology because God learns about the actual world through his decree?
God does not learn about the actual world through his decree. We have to recognize that this is the error that the Molinists make, is that they think that God's foreknowledge comes. They think that God's foreknowledge comes before his decree, whereas we would say, so they think God knows the future, or God decrees something because he knows the future. We would say God knows the future because he has decreed it. So we would have it the other way around. God does not have discursive thought. God does not change from subject to subject. That's why I hate it when people say like God has logic. I mean, it's true that obviously God is not a contradiction or anything like that, but God does not, strictly speaking, have logical processes in his mind or anything like that, because God comprehends everything in one simple eternal act that is identical to his essence. He does not have discursive reasoning passing from subject to subject. That is an imperfection and therefore should not be ascribed to God. So no, the way that God knows about the world is through his free knowledge, which is after his decree. So God knows what will happen because he has decreed it to happen. But God also has a knowledge of all possibilities about like what could happen, and that's through his necessary knowledge. But that also is not something that is determined by something outside of God, because, and this actually is another issue about divine possibilities. We would say that a thing is possible if God is able to do it. So possibilities are rooted in the divine power, not in the divine intellect.
Okay, great. Unrelated to the stream, when's the next meme review on a stream? Honestly, when I get a decent backlog, well, here's the thing: I have a lot of good memes, but
I sent you some great ones recently, dude.
Oh, you have, but
yeah, I've sent you some solids.
Let's be real. Most of the good ones that I get recently are not, shall we say, stream friendly. So, just to kind of be blunt about that, but I guess, especially posterior to the Tucker Carlson and Putin interview, there have been an absolute landslide of absolutely golden.
Yeah,
memes.
I haven't kept up with that. I keep seeing memes like
it's friggin' incredible. Yeah. I struck while the iron was hot in my own tweet where I made my own meme of that.
Secularism. Oh yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Tucker is like, where you haven't explained why Protestantism doesn't lead to anarchy, and then Putin all being, let me finish. Let me explain.
Actually, it's Pyrrhonic skepticism.
Yeah, exactly. The 16th, 17th century Jesuits resurrected Pyrrhonic skepticism. There's just a billion of those out there. The Babylon Bees Real News alternative, not the Bee, just put out a big compilation of those memes. They're absolutely golden. So I guess that could help one. And I have been considering recently maybe doing a semi-regular chill stream thing again on the channel, maybe fortnightly or so. But yeah, that's just gonna have to depend when I guess get a decent backlog of memes that aren't like a decade old. So and which are stream worthy, because again, I get a lot of good ones, not a lot of stream appropriate. So not that I think they're genuinely sinful. It's just I could get banned. Let's just be straight up. Okay.
The ones about the tunnels. The ones about the tunnels. That's all I'm gonna say. Just tunnels.
Oh, that's honestly like the least of yes, those are included, but that's like the least of them, to be real. Oh man, there's some absolute bangers out there. Speaking of which, we got to exchange some more after this. But in any event, to answer Joshua's, yes, we have already done the book recommendations. It was just before the Q&A, so if you want to rewatch and check, then we'll be able to do that. Yes, bring back Theocrat Lounge chill streams. Heck yeah, Borther. I may actually make that a supporter benefit as well, where it is a real chill thing, not just for like fellow YouTubers or whatever, but people who I don't know, support at X amount, they can come in and join the stream, have some fun with me. But yeah, in any event, that I believe is all we have for now. So, Matt, I believe you've already plugged your channel, your blog spot, your paper. Oh, no, hold up. We've got one more question. So logically, prior to his decree, God would not have knowledge about the actual world?
It depends on what you mean by actual world. But the whole problem, this whole question presupposes that something can be actual apart from the divine decree, which is the central error of Molinism. I'm guessing this commenter is a Molinist. That's my suspicion anyway. I would reject that presupposition. Nothing can be actualized apart from the divine decree. If it can be actualized apart from the divine decree, that would imply that it is necessary in itself, which means that you would fall into fatalism, the very trap you're trying to avoid.
Right. Fair enough. Anyway, with that said, so apart from the books, your blog, your YouTube, and your paper, is there anything else you want to recommend to people or give as a final word?
Yeah, I mean, I would say those are good places to start. I'd also say like, do you know Edwin Nunez? He has the
I do.
Scholasticism. Yeah, the Reformed Scholastic channel. I'd also check out that. He has some good stuff on these sorts of things. So just check out those guys who are big on Reformed Scholastic retrieval. I mean, I know I am, and there are plenty more. I would say go to those types of resources because that's a good place to kind of dip your feet in the water to start with this issue.
Excellent. Good stuff to hear. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a fantastic interview with Matt on the Reformed tradition's conception of free will. So, Matt, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Matt Hedges. This has been The Other Paul. I hope you all have a lovely day or evening. God bless.